Has expired. I therefore call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Interrupted debate on the first reading of the Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill.
Honourable members, the person who was last addressing the House on this piece of legislation was the Honourable Member Andrew Williams, and I would remind the member that he has 8 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill. Mr. Speaker, firstly I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate the input from Engineer John Scarry in relation to this, and over the last week or so since starting with my speech, Mr. Scarry has provided some very good considerable input into this issue. Firstly, I'd like to provide the definition. Earthquake-prone building is a building that will have its ultimate capacity exceeded in a moderate earthquake, and if it should collapse in a moderate earthquake, it is likely to cause injury or death or damage to another property. It can be constructed from any material. Further, a moderate earthquake under that definition is an earthquake that is 1/3 the strength of but the same duration as the code-specified earthquake for a new building on the same site. The findings of the Canterbury Earthquake Royal Commission are variable in quality, which is understandable given the enormous task the Commission was confronted with. Their recommendations with regard to earthquake-prone buildings must not be considered to be without flaw. The best evidence presented to the Commission on the performance of strengthened and unstrengthened unreinforced masonry buildings in the Christchurch earthquake was provided by Mr. Jason Ingham and Mr. Michael Griffith. This clearly showed that strengthening to even 50% of new building standard has little effect on the performance of the building in an extreme code level seismic event. Only strengthening to a minimum of 67% of new building standard does that. Strengthening up to 50% did not prevent complete destruction, but that was in earthquakes that had short durations of intense shaking, not 40 seconds or more as could be expected close to the main Alpine fault line or in Wellington. This Building Earthquake-Prone Buildings Amendment Bill is not about life safety in a code-level earthquake event. The performance of unreinforced masonry buildings in the Christchurch earthquake shows that, particularly in earthquakes with a long duration of intense shaking, even buildings strengthened to 50% new building standard suffered heavy or major damage or were destroyed. Therefore, what is expected to be gained in a major earthquake if the level of strengthening required is only just above 34%? The term new building standard really only applies to the percentage of code loading. The assessment of existing building seismic strength in accordance with the new New Zealand Society for Earthquake Engineering Red Book of 2006 is done on much less conservative basis than that used for the design of new buildings. This means that a 34% new building standard building has only about 25% or less of the strength of a competently designed new building. If we require a new building to have the equivalent of 100% code performance in order to achieve its life safety function in a code-level seismic event, what performance can we honestly expect of a building that has a strength equivalent to only 25% current code performance? This bill clarifies that once a building is classed as earthquake-prone, it need only be strengthened to be marginally above 34% new building standard to no longer be earthquake-prone. So why would we even bother? One of the very few useful aspects of the Building Act 2004 was a much more realistic treatment of earthquake-prone buildings. The 1/3 new building standard cut-off was used then as a means of identifying the most at-risk buildings, and it was then to be up to the local authority to determine what level of strengthening was to be required. The building stock that this bill is meant to deal with is enormous and varied. A very large number of buildings of extremely varied type, use and location. These buildings were in the main designed without the slightest regard to seismic loading and have materials and structural details that are the worst possible from the point of view of achieving robust seismic performance. The value of this building stock is enormous, the cost of strengthening or replacing them immense, and the resources required to assess and strengthen them formidable. Mr. Speaker, It is essential that the Minister and Select Committee dealing with this bill not go through the motions to simply rubber stamp it, but rather to treat every submission on its merits and lead to an Act that has the scope and flexibility to deal with a diversity of building stock throughout New Zealand. Mr Speaker, main streets throughout New Zealand will be greatly affected by the measures in this bill. The effects on provincial New Zealand will be huge. Many building owners simply will not be in a financial position to undertake the required upgrades. Main streets all over the country will literally be driven out of existence. What will that do for our provincial economies? Has full consideration been given to a reasonable compromise to help protect lives in the event of a sizable earthquake, such as, for instance, initially concentrating on checking and strengthening verandas over the pavements, which is where many people did die in the Christchurch earthquake? Also, have they looked into the likes of tax concessions and other subsidies to support the landlords that will be required to strengthen these buildings? Mr Speaker, this will impose a huge cost to New Zealanders throughout New Zealand in terms of commercial and other buildings. This could be crippling for the economy. We are concerned, New Zealand First, that perhaps the government has not thought through this fully, and that Main Street New Zealand, particularly in small towns and small provincial areas, will be up for huge cost. 2 minutes. Mr Speaker, with regards to the government scheme to contribute 25% to leaking building repairs, it was widely stated that this could have cost the government $1 billion if they had been taken up in full. But by the time GST and direct PAYE and company profit tax were considered, the actual cost of the government was almost nil. And that was without considering all the GST and tax as a result of the economic multiplier that came from the economic activity from fixing the leaky buildings. Similarly, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First is of the view that if we're going to go down this track and require landlords throughout New Zealand to bring their buildings up to a higher standard, to be these earthquake-prone buildings to be a higher standard, there must be some compensation to landlords, there must be some concessions, there must be some way that the government would support this going on, because the economic effects and the work that will be generated as a result of this will be considerable, and therefore the tax that results from the PAYE, GST and other aspects, company taxes, will be considerable. The government needs to take that into effect. Mr Speaker, the 4th of September 2010 earthquake in Christchurch may have acted as a safety valve, damaging and making off-limits many earthquake-prone buildings that would have otherwise caused numerous fatalities on the 22nd of February. However, it is a fact that over 70% of the fatalities on the 22nd of February were caused not by the collapse of earthquake-prone buildings, but by the collapse of 2 earthquake-risk buildings, namely the CTV building and the PGC building, rated later to be at 40% and 50% of the new building standard, respectively. Therefore, Mr Speaker, we urge, New Zealand First urges, that we do not try and impose something across the whole of New Zealand as a result of what perhaps happened in Christchurch, but that we look at this, and this goes to the Select Committee, and that the government does indeed listen to the experts on this matter, so that we don't go down the wrong path and impose huge costs on the whole of New Zealand.
I call the Honourable Member Jacqueline Dean.